After 5 decades of the al-Assad family rule and a 13-year civil war, Syria is now free of one of the world's most brutal dictatorships. In under 2 weeks, a coalition of armed forces led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, also known as HTS, marched through Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus and ousted President Bashar al-Assad, who fled to Russia. So what will Syria's future look like? Joining me now to discuss this is Bassam Haddad, founding director of the Middle East Studies program at George Mason University, Hala Rharrit, former Arabic language spokesperson for the U.S. State Department, Mustafa Akyol, Turkish journalist, author, and senior fellow at the CATO Institute, and from Moscow, Alexey Khlebnikov, consultant and Middle East expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. Thank you all for joining me. Bassam, I'm going to start with you. We've seen incredible images coming out of Syria. We've seen things like the toppled statue of Hafez al-Assad. We've seen thousands of detainees released from prisons. What does this moment mean for the Syrian people?
You know, we cannot underestimate how this moment is literally momentous in so many ways. It's the end of an era of literally brutal dictatorship. There's no mincing of words. And those who would like to see other aspects and dimension size of this can well do that, but not in a way that actually diminishes the repression that Syrians have faced for the past 54 years, in some eras more than others. And it is beyond the words relief that we should use to describe what's going on. And I have friends, I have family in Syria, but I also have friends who have been actually imprisoned in solitary confinement for as little as writing an article. And these people, mind you, are not necessarily either Islamists or supportive of a liberal American political order. They're actually pro-resistance. They're actually against imperial designs and actions in the region. And yet, if they actually overstep an iota, they could actually be reprimanded, imprisoned, or worse. So we're talking about an unprincipled dictatorship in so many ways, which is now symbolized by the manner in which the president simply left without a word to his people, even those who actually supported him.
That's interesting, Hala. I hear people all over the world echoing what Bassam has said, right? But then there were people who were saying, it's too, that's not right. This is American imperialism putting its thumb on the scale. This is Israel weighing in. The new, leadership is going to be worse. There were people who were saying that this is something other than a moment of celebration for the Syrian people. In light of what Bassam has said, should we be holding space for another idea or another thought at the same time?
That's a very good question. And I want to echo Bassam's words, that this is really a time to give Syrians space to celebrate after such brutal years, not just one, decades, really. But to your point, we are able to have two truths at the same time. And that's the reality of the situation. Obviously, we've seen how the changes were basically overnight, right? We woke up to the news and it was so quick, and the Syrians went out in the streets and are celebrating after years of trying to gain some type of freedom and legitimacy in their own country. And adding to Bassam's point, it wasn't merely political repression. It was day-to-day life that was so difficult for the average Syrian, not able to have sufficient electricity, struggling for food, struggling for gas. The basics of everyday life became untenable for Syrians, in addition to obvious political repression, political prisoners, families being ripped apart. At the same time, the second truth that lays right next to this first truth is that countries like the United States, countries like Israel, have been wanting to topple Assad for years, right? And this is very much known. And those in the anti-imperialist camp see this as a result of all of those years of interference. But to Bassam's point, considering everything that the Syrians have gone through, we need to give them space to be able to celebrate this moment with a clear mind as to the other forces that are at play and support the Syrian people in this transition and this revolutionary time in their country.
Mustafa, what do you make of this?
I share the joy and happiness of the Syrian people. They just got rid of a very brutal, sadistically cruel regime. And if anybody has not seen until this today, what's coming out of the Sadnaya prison and other torture chambers of this regime should teach us. I mean, I'm glad that the Syrian revolution succeeded, toppling one of the world's most cruel dictatorships. I mean, we should be happy about that in itself. Regarding the geopolitics of this, it's true that imperialism, colonialism has ravished this region, harmed the peoples of the Middle East and other parts of the world a lot. But also we should see that regimes that call themselves anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, can be very brutal in their own way. I think every regime should be measured first and foremost by looking at how they treat their own people. And if they treat their own people by putting them in dungeons and torturing because they wrote a critical tweet or wrote an article, I think that's evil. And whatever it stands on our geostrategic understandings, that regime has no legitimacy. Right causes should be pursued by right means. And if you're saying, okay, I'm defending the Palestinian people, I'm doing this, and that might be right in certain ways. But that becomes a justification for pretext for a regime which can be very brutal. And I think Syria is the most clear case of that.
Alexey, Russia was a staunch supporter of al-Assad throughout the war, and Russia's military intervention in 2015 turned the war in Assad's favor. Russia's military bases in Syria are also its only military foothold outside the former Soviet Union. For all the efforts Russia went through to prop up and prolong the Assad regime, including bombing Syrian civilians, how big a setback is this for Russia?
Well, in the first place, commenting on your words about Russia supporting Assad, from the very beginning of the onset of the civil war, Russia made it clear, and its leadership made it clear, that it was not supporting in particular a personality, but the state structures, the state regime. And one of the most important goals back in 2015, in September, when Russia decided to deploy its air forces there, was that actually it was about 2 or 3 weeks before collapsing under the offensive of ISIS back in 2015. And the main idea was to actually avoid that and to preserve the functioning state, basically. So it's not about the leadership, the figure itself as a personality, but the system.
For some, that might feel like a distinction, just for a moment, that might feel like a distinction without a difference to some folk, given that the system itself enabled this type of brutal repression and violence.
Well, we should distinguish, system, I mean, the repressive apparatus, the coercive apparatus, and the state structures. Even now, when HTS, terrorist organization, took power and took control over, Damascus, they actually, they're trying to get rid of the senior leadership, but I mean, they cannot just destroy all the state structures. And they've clearly declared that they want those who, employed and do their work continue to do that, because they don't want to, destroy everything and start from scratch. And I mean, actually, Syria was never been, the highest priority for Russia's foreign policy. And if you think, I mean, about the Russian military presence on the ground since 2015, it was quite limited. I mean, and again, you cannot compare it with the amount of Hezbollah fighters, Shia militias, or Iranian Al-Quds forces. I mean, it was quite limited. So for now, the biggest setback for Russia is definitely a risk of losing its military bases in the coast, and that's what currently Moscow is trying to negotiate. So far, they received guarantees from those who are in control, in power, that they guarantee so far security and presence there. But everything will be decided later by the government after transition period.
Hala, let me bring it back in. Hours after al-Assad's fall from power, Israel launched its first overt ground operation in Syria in about 50 years. Israel also drastically scaled up its air bombardment of Syria, destroyed its navy, and claims that they preemptively struck military targets. How do you see that? Is Israel exploiting the ostensible power vacuum here in order to make territorial or geopolitical gains?
I mean, without a doubt. The question is, how long is it going to stay that way, right? So I want to be clear, and I don't want to mince words either. This is an invasion, right? They're going in and going further into the Golan Heights. It is illegal. The United Nations has already come out and condemned the actions of Israel. Secondarily, they're attacking from the air and basically destroying every military apparatus of the Syrian state. But the question is, what is the impact of all this beyond Israel's strategic means of securing itself? If the goal of the international community is to have a successful Syria, this is quite destabilizing, right? They're almost setting up these rebels, whatever you want to call them, they're almost setting them up for failure.
How so?
Their focus is supposed to now be consolidating state apparatuses, consolidating their own power, trying to hopefully unify the Syrian people. But at the same time, when you have a foreign aggressor bombing, incurring into more territory, it's destabilizing. The question is, and again, this goes into the realm of conspiracy theory, so I don't want to go too much into this conversation, but were there agreements made beforehand to basically allow some of this to occur?
Agreements between potentially, like you're saying, like HTS?
Look, I can just say this. As an American diplomat who previously worked on counterterrorism, I am absolutely stunned at the transformation of someone like Julani, who previously had a $10 million bounty on his head, who was previously arrested by US forces in Iraq and was in prisons including Abu Ghraib, right? He's a designated terrorist, but at this point, his rebranding has been extraordinary.
Bassam, when we think about Israel's interests beyond securing their own sort of state, which is their argument, right? We're doing this for our own safety. It's a war on terrorism abroad, et cetera. What other concerns should we have about their kind of geopolitical aspirations? Is this part of the greater Israel project? Is this a goal for plunder? Is this a goal for territorial expansion? What should we be thinking about here?
Well, beyond the moral and political position on the dictatorship in Syria, there's a huge world that we should pay attention to, and we should look at the connections. The viewpoint, in my view, should not exclude the connection between Israel and the United States in almost engineering so much of what has happened in the past 25 years. When you look into the Syrian situation today, you see things that you cannot deny. But if you do not zoom out historically and analytically, you will not see the pattern of the destruction of every single state that has, in one way or another, opposed US foreign policy in the region or Israel's hegemony or domination and expansion in the region, from Yemen to Somalia to Sudan to Libya to Syria to Iraq and Lebanon in various ways. It is uncanny how this is I don't want to say orchestrated, but orchestrated is definitely part of the game, to remove any obstacles to almost complete domination of the US in the region. The lay of the land in the future is now going to be very open for any Israeli, US, and friends domination without any response. Iran, as you will see, will also be not necessarily next in the sort of the simple sense, but will be also under so much pressure to not continue this resistance axis that we have seen crumble, whether or not the components of the resistance axis are your or my or anybody else's cup of tea.
Mustafa, let's talk about Turkey for a minute, because Turkey's played a very important role in all of this. They backed the key armed groups who overthrew al-Assad. Why does Turkey make this choice? What's Turkey's motivation in supporting these groups?
Yeah, I mean, I was in Turkey when the Syrian revolution began in 2011. And actually, initially in the first months, I remember that the Turkish government, which had good relations with Assad before, I tried to convince him for a transition, like announce free elections, let's support you. I mean, the revolution began, so just let it be not like Libya and all that. Assad regime didn't give up, and he started brutalizing his people. So then Turkey jumped on the opposition wagon. And I can say, I mean, I have many criticisms of the Turkish government on a lot of domestic issues. But I think I can say Turkey has stood on the right side of history on this.
But,
I mean, Assad regime was evil, terrible, and it was doomed to collapse. And ultimately, with great pain, it did collapse. And now Turkey will play
How
a
much of this
role.
was self-interest, though? How much of it was like, hey, we want these refugees to go back?
Everything.
You know, Erdogan will have a much stronger position in the West.
Of course, there is self-interest, but I think that the ruling cadre in Turkey were genuinely horrified by the suffering of the Sunni, majority population, as they are. I mean, with Gaza, I mean, people do have feelings, and I think that was there, and they have ideological links too. I mean, Syrian Islamic groups had friendships with Turkey's AKP. So besides that, I mean, Turkey opened its borders to Syrian refugees, and I think that's a good thing. I mean, Turkey welcomed more than 3 million refugees. Now, an anti-refugee xenophobia emerged in Turkey, and but more on the opposition side, I should say. Now, Turkey is happy for, I think, a few reasons. First of all, I mean, Syria will not be a probably hostile regime anymore. The builders of New Syria, who will they be? We will see HTS and others, hopefully in a more democratic way. Turkey will try to steer that.
Bassam, you were about to jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that even though Mustafa and I had a really nice time in the waiting room, I am really I'm really concerned about this idea that the Turks or Turkey or Turkey or Erdogan or the Turkish government are horrified by what's happening in Syria. Directly before the uprising, the Turkish government and its business sort of businessmen, business communities were connecting with the Syrian regime in one of the most grand-scale projects supposedly to happen in the Middle East. They had no problem with Syria. Turkish products were seen all over Syria on all of the shelves. There was not that kind of a repulsed nature. What happened is right during the early part of the uprising, there was a rift, and then Turkey adopted this position. But Turkey is not alone. All of the other countries have actually had double standards on all this. And we actually also, I mean, it's really interesting that we're talking about Syria. We're talking about the kind of repression that existed within Syria, which is absolutely correct. But this is taking place while at the same time the United States and Israel are committing one of the most horrendous genocides in modern history happening today in 2024, not in the 19th century. And we should actually recognize the connection between what is happening in Palestine, what Israel is doing in Gaza, and everything else. And finally, this view, when people in the United States, especially here, look at what's happening in Syria and prisons, which is extremely horrendous at all levels, we should not forget that we live in a country that has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, where more than 1% of the adult population is in jail. More than 2 million people are in jail in horrendous conditions and violent conditions, and more than 38% of those in jail are African Americans. So as we look at all of this, we should recognize from what perspective we're saying this and who we are, because we are administering so much of the ills that is taking place. I'm not excusing anybody.
All right, before we go, I hate to make you pull your crystal balls out, but there is a way that I'd love to get your sense. In the midst of all the uprising, all the tension, all the resistance, all the pushback, all the things that are happening, how do you think this thing turns out in the short term? Alexey, I'll start with you.
Oh, well, it's a good question in the first place. I mean, regardless of either one, happy or cheerful about what's happening in Syria, it's just one chapter which is over, but the story will continue, and there is no end, in the foreseeable future. I mean, first of all, a terrorist organization came to power. A terrorist organization, now seeing how just in the matter of 2 weeks, all media around the globe just changing their mind, changing and coming up with new definitions and words for who is Julani. Now he is a progressive jihadist. What does that mean? That's first thing. Second thing, HTS is not a homogeneous and monolithic group in Syria. It consists of a variety of different groups of different degree of radicalism, and where is a guarantee that Julani and his affiliates will be able to keep that in control? Where guarantees that there will be no infight between all of these groups? How we can be sure that the new government, transition government, will not get back to a sectarian politics and practices? How to make sure that Israel not advancing, because now it's not only airstrikes, as the colleague were mentioning. I mean, tanks and the ground forces moving. I mean, they're already in Sueda province, parts of Dera province where Druze minority is living, and they're advancing. and they've been destroying not only military sites, but even the sites with information, with analytical centers. Me personally, I have no kind of positive or happiness, for what lies ahead. I mean, it's a very hard road with a lot of ifs, with a lot of possible scenarios, and with a high degree of further destabilization and chaos.
Mustafa.
Glad that Assad regime is gone, but of course we'll see now what comes next. And two things are important here. One is whether the HTS will keep on the moderate path, that it's been signaling lately. And in Idlib, there are some examples of that, which they govern already. Obviously, they're a group rooted in very radical Salafi jihadism, which goes all the way to Al-Qaeda. But they've changed to some extent. And that should be given a chance, and that should be encouraged furthermore. And Turkey can actually play a helpful role there. Actually, Turkey helped the moderation of HTS back in Idlib, as far as I know. The other risk is a tension now with the Kurdish armed groups and the new government in Damascus. And that could be also diffused instead of ignited. Now, one thing there, of course, Turkey is important here again as the kingmaker, and also both the country that has the biggest problem with the Kurdish forces there. Now, one thing that happened in Turkey is that Turkey has been pretty hawkish against the PKK in the several years, but lately Turkey has started giving signals of a reconciliation with the PKK in Turkey, taking their leader out of jail, bringing him to parliament. So if the region is lucky, if Turkey softens its tones inside Turkey, if there's a reconciliation, a peace process in Turkey again, and if SDF, if the Kurdish forces in Syria actually keep giving on reconciliatory messages, which they've been doing in the past few days.
There's a chance of some de-escalation and some peace here.
Yeah, we should all work to see a peaceful Syria, which is not going to be heaven, but it could be on the right path if...
The right path is a great start. Hala, what say you?
I want to be hopeful too. It's a very precarious time, right? I think time will tell. But the reality is that a lot of powers are invested in at least a stable Syria at the moment, right? The goal of the United States and Israel both has been to topple Assad. They got their goal. They won, right? And so now what are they going to do? Again, I go back to the economic realities because I think that is what matters the most to Syrians. Are the Gulf Arab states going to come, going to assist? Are they going to provide alternatives to the Captagon trade, to any type of actual resources for institutions? I found it very interesting that when Jolani spoke, he kept on referring to institutions, building the institutions of the state. It almost seems lessons learned from perhaps Iraq, lessons learned from Libya, making sure not to repeat the mistakes of regional actors. So we will see, but again, the disunity has to turn into actual tangible unity, words into action in terms of less repression and an inclusive society. And I hope for the Syrian people that it's bright days ahead.
Ultimately, the folks, the people, the states, the actors that have actually worked to give the green light, including Turkey, to give the green light for HTS to come out under what trade-offs with the United States and other Arab governments, we don't know. Those states are not going to let any single party rule in Syria, and definitely not HTS. They're going to all work in the next several months to make sure that a government in Syria is perhaps representative, but more importantly, heterogeneous, because heterogeneity will mean you reduce the possibility of collective action, especially regarding acting abroad. Linchpin of the resistance axis was Syria. This has to be cut off based on all of the actors that have played a role in this, so that this new government and the new polity is not going to be able to act in the same way that the previous regime did, whether or not the previous regime, whether or not however you feel about the previous regime. And that is almost a guarantee. You will see a Syria that is weakened. You will see an Arab state system that is weakened in relation to opposing existing domination of the region. And one hopes, out of all of this, I hope that Syrians will finally be able to express themselves. But this expression is going to be very domestic, very limited, very local. But so many Syrians today will take that, and I will take that.
I have to be the last word. Bassam Haddad, Hala Rharrit, Alexey Khlebnikov, and Mustafa Akyol. Thank you so much for joining me. Everybody, that is our show. Up front, we'll be back next week.